Lady into Fox by David Garnett. So the more anguish of shame his vixen underwent, the greater his hopes rose, till his love and pity for her increasing equally, he was almost wishing her to be nothing more than a mere fox and to suffer so much by being half human. At last he looked about him somewhat dazed with so much weeping, then set his vixen down on the ottoman and began to clean up the room with a heavy heart. He fetched a pail of water and washed out all the stains of blood, gathered up the 2 anti-massacres and fetched clean ones from the other rooms. While he went about this work, his vixen sat and watched him very contritely with her nose between her 2 front paws, and when he had done he brought in some luncheon for himself, though it was already late, but none for her, for she having lately so infamously feasted. But water he gave her, and a bunch of grapes. Afterwards she led him to the small tortoise-shell cabinet and would have him open it. When he had done so she motioned to the portable stereoscope which lay inside. Mr. Tebrick instantly fell in with her wish, and after a few trials adjusted it to her vision. Thus they spent the rest of the afternoon together, very happily looking through the collection of views which he had purchased, of Italy, Spain, and Scotland. This diversion gave her great apparent pleasure and afforded him considerable comfort. But that night he could not prevail upon her to sleep in his bed with him, and finally allowed her to sleep on a mat beside the bed, where he could stretch down and touch her. So they passed the night with his hand upon her head. The next morning he had more of a struggle than ever to wash and dress her. Indeed, at one time, nothing but holding her by the scruff prevented her from getting away from him, but at last he achieved his object, and she was washed, brushed, scented, and dressed, although to be sure this left him better pleased than her, for she regarded her silk jacket with disfavour. Still at breakfast she was well-mannered, though a trifle hasty with her food. Then his difficulties with her began, for she would go out, but as he had his housework to do, he could not allow it. He brought her picture books to divert her, but she would have none of them, but stayed at the door, scratching it with her claws industriously, till she had worn away the paint. At first he tried coaxing her and wheedling, gave her cards to play, patience, and so on, but finding nothing would distract her from going out, his temper began to rise, and he told her plainly that she must wait his pleasure, and that he had as much natural obstinacy as she had. But to all that he said, she paid no heed whatever, but only scratched the harder. Thus he let her continue until luncheon, where she would not sit up, or eat off a plate, but first was for getting on to the table, and when that was prevented, snatched her meat and ate it under the table. To all his rebukes she turned a deaf or sullen ear, and so they each finished their meal, eating little, either of them, for till she would sit at table he would give her no more, and his vexation had taken away his own appetite. In the afternoon he took her out for her airing in the garden. She made no pretence now of enjoying the first snowdrops or the view from the terrace. No, there was only one thing for her now, the ducks, and she was off to them before he could stop her. Luckily, they were all swimming when she got there, for a stream running into the pond on the far side was not frozen there. When he had got down to the pond, she ran out onto the ice, which would not bear his weight, and though he called her and begged her to come back, she would not heed him, but stayed frisking about, getting as near the ducks as she dared, but being circumspect in venturing onto the thin ice. Presently she turned on herself and began tearing off her clothes, and at last, by biting, got off her little jacket, and taking it in her mouth, stuffed it into a hole in the ice where he could not get it. Then she ran hither and thither a stark naked vixen, and without giving a glance to her poor husband, who stood silently now upon the bank, with despair and terror settled in his mind. She let him stay there, most of the afternoon, till he was chilled through and worn out with watching her. At last, he reflected how she had just stripped herself, and how in the morning she struggled against being dressed, and he thought perhaps he was too strict with her, and if he let her have her own way, they could manage to be happy somehow together, even if she did eat off of the floor. So he called out to her then, "Sylvia, come now, be good. You shan't wear any more clothes if you don't want to, and you needn't sit at table neither, I promise. You shall do as you like in that, but you must give up one thing, and that is you must stay with me and not go out alone, for that is dangerous. If any dog came onto you, he would kill you." Directly he had finished speaking, she came to him joyously, began fawning on him and prancing round him, so that in spite of his vexation with her and being cold, he could not help stroking her. "Oh, Sylvia, are you not wilful and cunning? I see you glory in being so, but I shall not reproach you, but shall stick to my side of the bargain, and you must stick to yours." He built a big fire when he came back to the house, and took a glass or two of spirits also to warm himself up, for he was chilled to the very bone. Then after they had dined, to cheer himself he took another glass, and then another, and so on, till he was very merry, he thought. Then he would play with his vixen, she encouraging him with her pretty sportiveness. He got up to catch her, then, and finding himself unsteady on his legs, he went down onto all fours. The long and short of it is that by drinking he drowned all his sorrow, and then would be a beast too, like his wife, but she was one through no fault of her own, and could not help it. To what lengths he went then in that drunken humour I shall not offend my readers by relating, but shall only say he was so drunk and sottish that he had very imperfect recollection of what had passed when he woke the next morning. There is no exception to the rule that if a man drink heavily at night, the next morning will show the other side of his nature. Thus with Mr. ʟᴏᴏ, for he had been beastly, merry, and a very daredevil the night before, and so on his wakening was he ashamed, melancholic, and a true penitent before his sin. Then he fell into earnest prayer, and continued so for half an hour upon his knees. Then he got up and dressed, but continued very melancholy for the whole of the morning. Being in this mood, you may imagine it hurt him to see his wife running about naked, but he reflected it would be a bad reformation that began with breaking faith. He had made a bargain, and he would stick with it, and so he let her be, though sorely against his will. For the same reason, that is, because he would stick to his side of the bargain, he did not require her to sit up at the table, but gave her breakfast on a dish in the corner, where, to tell the truth, she on her side ate it all up with great daintiness and propriety. Nor did she make any attempt to go out of doors that morning, but lay curled up in an armchair before the fire, dozing. After lunch he took her out, and she never so much as offered to go near the ducks, but running before him led him on to take her a longer walk. This he consented to do, very much to her joy and delight. He took her through the fields by the most unfrequented ways, being much alarmed lest they should be seen by anyone, but by good luck they walked above 4 miles across country and saw nobody. All the way, his wife kept running on ahead of him, and then back to him to lick his hand and so on, and appeared delighted at taking exercise. And though they startled 2 or 3 rabbits and a hare in the course of their walk, she never attempted to go after them, only giving them a look, and then looking back at him, laughing at him as if it were for his warning cry of "Puss, come on, no nonsense now." But when they got home and were going into the porch, they came face to face with an old woman. Mr. ʟᴏᴏ stopped short in consternation, and looked about for his vixen, as she had run forward without any shyness to greet her. Then he recognized the intruder, It was his wife's old nurse. "What are you doing here, Mrs. Cork?" he asked her. Mrs. Cork answered him in these words. "Poor thing, poor Mrs. Sylvia. It is a shame to let her run about like a dog. It is a shame, and your own wife too. But whatever she looks like, you should trust her the same as ever. If you do, she'll do her best to be a good wife to you. If I don't, you shouldn't wonder if she did turn into a proper fox. I saw her, sir, before I left, and I've had no peace of mind. I shouldn't sleep thinking of her, so I've come back to look after her, as I have done all her life, sir." As she stooped down and took Mrs. Tibrick by the paw. Mr. Tibrick unlocked the door, and they went in. When Mrs. Cork saw the house, she exclaimed again and again, "This place was a pigsty. They couldn't live like that. A gentleman must have somebody to look after him. She would do it. He could trust her with the secret." Had the old woman came the day before, it is likely enough that Mrs. Tibrick would have sent her packing. But the voice of conscience being woken in him by his drunkenness of the night before, he was heartily ashamed of his own management of the business. Moreover, the old woman's words that it was a shame to let her run about like a dog moved him exceedingly. Being in this mood, the truth is he welcomed her. But we may conclude that Mrs. Tibrick was as sorry to see her old nanny as her husband was glad. If we consider that she had been brought up strictly by her when she was a child, and was now again in her power, and that her old nurse could never be satisfied with her whatever she did, but would always think her wicked to be a fox at all, there seems good reason for her dislike. And it is possible, too, that there may have been another cause as well, and that is jealousy. We know her husband was always trying to bring her back to be a woman, or at any rate to get her to act like one. May she not have been hoping to get him to be like a beast himself, or to act like one? May she not have thought it easier to change him thus than ever to change herself, being back into being a woman? If we think that she had had a successive kind only the night before when he got drunk, can we not conclude that this was indeed the case, and then we have another good reason why the poor lady should hate to see her old nurse? It is certain that whatever hopes Mr. Tibrick had of Mrs. Cork affecting his wife for the better were disappointed. She grew steadily wilder, and after a few days so intractable with her that Mr. Tibrick again took her under his complete control. The first morning Mrs. Cork made her a new jacket, cutting down the sleeves of blue silk, one of Mrs. Tibrick's, and trimming it with swan's down, and directly she had altered it, put it on her mistress, and fetching a mirror, would have her admire the fit of it. All the time she waited on Mrs. Tibrick, the old woman talked to her as though she were a baby, and treated her as such, never thinking perhaps that she was either the one thing or the other, that is, either a lady to whom she owed respect and who had rational powers exceeding her own, or else a wild creature on whom words were wasted. But though at first she submitted passively, Mrs. Tibrick only waited for her nanny's back to be turned to tear up her pretty piece of handiwork into shreds, and then ran gaily about, waving her brush with only a few ribbons still hanging from her neck. So it was time after time, for the old woman was used to having her own way, until Mrs. Cork would, I think, have tried punishing her, if she had not been afraid of Mrs. Tibrick's rows of white teeth, which she often showed her, then laughing afterwards as if to say it was only play. Not content with tearing off the dresses that were fitted on her, one day Sylvia slipped upstairs to her wardrobe and tore down all her old dresses and made havoc with them, not sparing her wedding dress either, but tearing and ripping them all up, so that there was hardly a shred or rag left big enough to dress a doll in. On this, Mr. Tibrick, who had left the old woman have most of her management to see what she could make of her, took her back under his own control. He was sorry enough that Mrs. Cork had disappointed him in the hopes he had had of her, to have had the old woman, as it were, on his hands. True, she could be useful enough in many ways to him by doing the housework, the cooking or mending, but still he was anxious, since his secret was in her keeping, and the more now that she had tried her hand with his wife and failed. For he saw that vanity had kept her mouth shut if she had won over her mistress to better ways, and her love for her would have grown by getting her way with her. But now that she had failed, she bore her mistress a grudge for not being won over, or, at the best, was becoming very different to the whole business, so that she might readily blab. For the moment, all Mr. ʟᴏᴏ could do was to keep her from going into Stokoe to the village, where she would meet all her old cronies, and where there were certain to be any number of inquiries about what was going on at Rylands and such. But as he saw that it was clearly beyond his power, however vigilant he might be, to watch over the old woman and his wife, and to prevent anyone from meeting with either of them, he began to consider what he could best do. Since he had sent away his servant and the gardener, giving out a story of having received bad news, and his wife going away to London where he would join her, their probably going out of England and so on, he knew well enough that there would be a great deal of talk in the neighbourhood. And, as he had now stayed on, contrary to what he had said, there would be further rumour. Indeed, had he known it, there was a story already going around the country that his wife had run away with Major Solmes, and that he was gone mad with grief, that he had shot his dogs and his horses, and shut himself up alone in the house, and would speak to no one. This story was made up by his neighbours, not because they were fanciful or wanted to deceive, but, like most tittle-tattle, to fill a gap, as few like to confess ignorance, and if people are asked about such or such a man, they must have something to say, or they suffer in everybody's opinion and are set down as dull or out of the swim. In this way, I met not long ago with someone who, after talking in some little while, and not knowing me or who I was, told me that David Garnett was dead, and died of being bitten by a cat after he had tormented it. He had long grown a nuisance to his friends as an exorbitant sponge upon them, and the world was well rid of him. Hearing this story of myself diverted me at the time, but I fully believe it has served me in good stead since. For it set me on my guard, as perhaps nothing else would have done, against accepting for true all floating rumour and village gossip, so that now I am by second nature a true sceptic, and scarcely believe anything unless the evidence for it is conclusive. Indeed, I could never have got to the bottom of this history if I had believed 1/10th part of what I was told. There was so much of it that was either manifestly false and absurd, or else contradictory to the ascertained facts. It is therefore only the bare bones of the story which you will find written here, for I have rejected all the flowery embroideries, which would be entertaining reading enough, I dare say, for some, but if there be any doubt of the truth of a thing, it is a poor sort of entertainment to read about in my opinion. To get back to our story, Mr. ʟᴏᴏ, having considered how much the appetite of his neighbours would be whetted to find out the mystery by his remaining in that part of the country, determined that the best thing he could do was to remove. After some time, turning the thing over in his head, he decided that no place would be so good for his purpose as old Nanny's cottage. It was 30 miles away from Stokoe, which in the country means as far as Timbuktu does to us in London. Then it was near Tangley, and his lady, having known it from her childhood, would feel at home there, and also it was utterly remote, there being no village near it or manor house other than Tangley Hall, which was now untenanted for the greater part of the year. Nor did it mean imparting his secret to others, for there was only Mrs. Cork's son, the widower, who, being out at work all day, would be easily outwitted, the more so as he was stone deaf and of a slow and saturnine disposition. To be sure, there was little Polly, Mrs. Cork's granddaughter, but either Mr. Tebrick forgot her altogether, or else reckoned her as a mere baby and not to be thought of as a danger. He talked the thing over with Mrs. Cork, and they decided upon it out of hand. The truth is, the old woman was beginning to regret that her love and her curiosity had ever brought her back to the Rylands, since so far she had gotten much work and little credit by it. When it was settled, Mr. Tebrick disposed of the remaining business he had at Rylands in the afternoon, and that was chiefly putting out his wife's riding horse into the keeping of a farmer nearby, for he thought he would drive over with his own horse, and the other spare horse tandem in the dog-cart. The next morning they locked up the house and they departed, having first secured Mrs. Tebrick in a large wicker hamper where she would be tolerably comfortable. This was for safety, for in the agitation of driving she might jump out, and on the other hand, if a dog scented her and she were loose, she might be in danger of her life. Mr. Tebrick drove with the hamper beside him on the front seat, and spoke to her gently, very often. She was overcome by the excitement of the journey, and kept poking her nose first through one crevice, then through another, turning and twisting the whole time, and peeping out to see what they were passing. It was a bitterly cold day, and when they had gone about 15 miles, they drew up by the roadside to rest the horses and have their own luncheon, for he dared not stop at an inn. He knew that any living creature in a hamper, even if it be only an old fowl, always draws attention. There would be several loafers, most likely he would notice that he had a fox with him, and even if he left the hamper in the cart, the dogs at the inn would be sure to sniff out our scent. So, not to take any chances, he drew up at the side of the road and rested there, though it was freezing hard and a north-east wind howling. He took down his precious hamper, unharnessed his 2 horses, covered them with rugs, and gave them their corn. Then he opened the basket and let his wife out. She was quite beside herself with joy, running hither and thither, bouncing up on him, looking about her, and even rolling over on the ground. Mrs. Tebrick took this to mean she was glad at making this journey, and rejoiced equally with her. As for Mrs. Cork, she sat motionless on the back seat of the dog-cart, well wrapped up, eating her sandwiches, but wished not to speak a word. When they had stayed there half an hour, Mr. Tebrick harnessed the horses again, though he was so cold he could scarcely buckle the straps, and put his vixen in her basket. But, seeing that she wanted to look about her, he let her tear away the osiers with her teeth till she had made a hole big enough for her to put her head out of. They drove on again, and then the snow began to come down, and that in earnest, so that he began to be afraid that they would never cover the ground. But just after nightfall they got in, and he was content to leave unharnessing the horses and baiting them to Simon, Mrs. Cork's son. His vixen was tired by then, as well as he, and they slept together, he in the bed and she under it, very contentedly. His vixen was tired by then, as well as he, and they slept together, he in the bed and she under it, very contentedly. The next morning he looked about him at the place and found the thing that he most wanted, and that was a little walled-in garden where his wife could run in freedom and play safely. After they had had breakfast, she was wild to go out into the snow, so they went out together, and he had never seen such a mad creature in all his life as his wife was then, for she ran to and fro as if she were crazy, biting at the snow and rolling in it, and round in circles, and rushed back at him fiercely as if she meant to bite him. He joined her in a frolic and began snowballing her till she was so wild that all he could do to quiet her again was to bring her indoors for luncheon. Indeed, with bowling, she tracked the whole garden over with her feet. He could see where she had rolled in the snow and where she had danced in it, and looking at those prints of her feet as they went in made his heart ache, he knew not why. They passed the first day at old Nanny's cottage happily enough, without their usual bickerings, and this because of the novelty of the snow which had diverted them. In the afternoon, he first showed his wife to little Polly, who eyed her very curiously, but hung back shyly, and seemed a good deal afraid of the fox. But Mr. ʟᴏᴏ took up a book, and let them get acquainted by themselves, and presently looking up, saw that they had come together, and Polly was stroking his wife, patting her and running her fingers through her fur. Presently she began talking to the fox, and then brought her doll in to show her, and so that very soon they were very good playmates together. Watching the two gave Mr. ʟᴏᴏ great delight, and in particular when he noticed that there was something very motherly in his vixen. She was indeed far above the child in intelligence, and restrained herself, too, from any hasty action. But while she seemed to wait on Polly's pleasure, yet she managed to give a twist to the game, whatever it was, that never failed to delight the little girl. In short, in a very little while, Polly was so taken with her new playmate that she cried when she was parted from her, and wanted her always with her. This disposition of Mr. ʟᴏᴏ's made Mrs. Cork more agreeable than she had lately either to the husband or the wife. Three days after they had come to the cottage, the weather changed, and they woke up one morning to find the snow gone, and the wind in the south, and the sun shining, and so that it was like the first beginning of spring. Mr. ʟᴏᴏ let his vixen out into the garden after breakfast, stayed with her a while, and then went indoors to write some letters. When he got out again, he could see no sign of her anywhere, so that he ran about bewildered, calling to her. At last he spied a mound of fresh earth by the wall in one corner of the garden, and running hither, found that there was a hole freshly dug, seeming to go under the wall. On this he ran out of the garden quickly till he came to the other side of the wall, but there was no hole there, so he concluded that she was not yet got through. So it proved to be, for reaching down into the hole he felt her brush with his hand, and could hear her distinctly working away with her claws. He called her then, saying, "Sylvia, Sylvia, why do you do this? Are you trying to escape from me? I am your husband, and if I keep you confined, it is to protect you and not to let you run into danger. Show me how I can make you happy, and I will do it, but do not try to escape from me. I love you, Sylvia. Is it because of that you want to fly from me to go into the world where you will be in danger of your life always? There are dogs everywhere, and they would all kill you if it were not for me. Come out, Sylvia, come out." But Sylvia would not listen to him, so he waited there, silent. Then he spoke to her in a different way, asking her had she forgot the bargain she made with him that she would not go out alone, but now, when she had all the liberty of a garden to herself, she would wantonly break her word. And he asked her, were they not married, and had she not always found him a good husband to her? But she heeded this neither, until presently, his temper getting somewhat out of hand, he cursed her obstinacy, and told her if she would be a damned fox she was welcome to it. For his part he could get his way. She had not escaped yet. He would dig her out, for he still had time, and if she struggled, put her in a bag. These words brought her forth instantly, as she looked at him with as much astonishment as if she knew not what could have made him angry. Yes, she even fawned on him, but in a good-natured kind of way, as if she were a very good wife, putting up wonderfully with her husband's temper. These airs of her made the poor gentleman, so simple was he, repent his outburst and feel most ashamed. But for all that, when she was foot of the hole, he filled it up with great stones and beat them in with a crowbar, so she should find her work at that point harder than before, as she was tempted to begin it again. In the afternoon, he let her go again to the garden, but sent little Polly with her to keep her company. But presently, on looking out, he saw his vixen had climbed up into the limbs of an old pear tree and was looking over the wall, and was not so far from it, but she might jump over it if she could get a little further. Mr. ʟᴏᴏ ran out into the garden as quick as he could, and when his wife saw him, it seemed she was startled and made a false spring at the wall, so that she missed reaching it and fell back heavily to the ground and lay there insensible. When Mr. ʟᴏᴏ got up to her, he found her head was twisted under her by her fall, and the neck seemed to be broken. The shock was so great to him that, for some time, he could not do anything but knelt beside her, turning her limp body stupidly in his hands. At length, he recognized that she was indeed dead, and began to consider what dreadful afflictions God had visited him with. He blasphemed horribly and called on God to strike him dead, or give his wife back to him. "Is it not enough," he cried, adding a foul, blasphemous oath, "that you should rob me of my dear wife, making her a fox, but now you must rob me of that fox too, that has been my only solace and comfort in this affliction?" Then he burst into tears and began wringing his hands, and continued there in such an extremity of grief for half an hour that he cared nothing, neither what he was doing, nor what would become of him in the future, but only knew that his life was ended now, and he would not live any longer than he could help. All this while the little girl Polly stood by, first staring, then asking him what had happened, and lastly crying with fear. But he never heeded her, nor looked at her, but only tore his hair, sometimes shouted at God, or shook his head at heavens. So in a fright, Polly opened the door and ran out of the garden. At length, worn out, and as it were all numb with his loss, Mr. ʟᴏᴏ got up and went within doors, leaving his dear fox lying there where she had fallen. He stayed indoors only 2 minutes, and then came out again with a razor in his hand, intending to cut his own throat, for he was out of his senses in this first paroxysm of grief. But his vixen was gone, at which he looked about for a moment, bewildered, and then enraged, thinking that somebody must have taken the body. The door of the garden being open, he ran straight through it. Now this door, which had been left ajar by Polly when she ran off, opened into a little courtyard where the fowls were shut in at night. The wood-house and the privy also stood there. On the far side of it from the garden gate were 2 large wooden doors, big enough when open to let a cart enter, and high enough to keep a man from looking over into the yard. When Mr. ʟᴏᴏ got into the yard, he found his vixen leaping up at these doors and wild with terror, but as lively as ever he saw her in his life. He ran up to her, but she shrank away from him, and would then have dodged him too, but he caught hold of her. She bared her teeth at him, but he paid no heed to that, only picked her straight up into his arms and took her so indoors. Yet all the while he could not scarce believe his eyes to see her living, and felt her all over very carefully to find if she had not some bones broken. But no, he could find none. Indeed, it was some hours before this poor silly gentleman began to suspect the truth, which was that his vixen had practised a deception upon him, and all the time he was bemoaning his loss in such heart-rending terms, she was only shamming death, to run away directly she was able. If it had not been that the yard gates were shut, which was a mere chance, she had got her liberty by that trick, and that this was only a trick of hers, so sham-dead was plain when he had thought it over. Indeed, it is an old and time-honoured trick of the fox. It is an Aesop, and 100 other writers have confirmed it since. But so thoroughly had he been deceived by her, that at first he was as much overcome with joy at his wife still being alive as he had been with grief a little while before, seeing her dead. He took her in his arms, hugging to him and thanking God 12 times for her preservation. But his kissing and fondling her had very little effect now, for she did not answer him by licking or soft looks, but stayed huddled up and sullen, with her hair bristling on her neck and her ears laid back every time he touched her. At first, he thought this might be because he had touched some broken bone or tender place where she had been hurt, but at last the truth came to him. Thus, he was again to suffer, and through the pain of knowing her treachery to him was nothing to the grief of losing her, yet it was more insidious and lasting. At first, from a mere nothing, this pain grew gradually until it was a torture to him. If he had been one of your stock ordinary husbands, such a one who by experience has learnt never to inquire too closely into his wife's doings, her comings or goings, and never to ask her how she has spent the day, for fear he should be made the more fool. But had Mr. ʟᴏᴏ been such one, he had been luckier, and his pain would have been almost nothing. But you must consider that he had never been deceived once by his wife in the course of their married life. No, she had never told him as much as one white lie, but had always been frank, open, and ingenuous, as if she and her husband were not husband and wife, or indeed of opposite sexes. Yet we must rate him as very foolish, that living thus with a fox, which beast has the same reputation for deceitfulness, craft, and cunning in all countries, all ages, and amongst all races of mankind, he should expect this fox to be as candid and honest with him in all things as a country girl he had married. His wife's sullenness and bad temper continued that day, for she cowered away from him and hid under the sofa, nor could he persuade her to come out from there. Even when it was her dinner time, she stayed, refusing resolutely to be tempted out with food, and lying so quiet that he heard nothing from her for hours. At night, he carried her up to the bedroom, but she was still sullen and refused to eat a morsel, though she drank a little water during the night, when she fancied he was asleep. The next morning was the same, and by now Mr. ʟᴏᴏ had been through all the agonies of wounded self-esteem, disillusionment, and despair that a man can suffer. But though his emotions rose up in his heart and nearly stifled him, he showed no sign of them to her, neither did he abate one jot his tenderness and consideration for his vixen. At breakfast he tempted her with a freshly killed young pullet. It hurt him to make this advance to her, for hitherto he had kept her strictly on cooked meats, but the pain of seeing her refuse it was harder still for him to bear. Added to this was now an anxiety lest she should starve herself to death rather than stay with him any longer. All the morning he kept her close, but in the afternoon let her loose again in the garden after he had lopped the pear tree, so that she could not repeat her performance of climbing. But seeing how disgustedly she looked while he was by, never offering to run or to play as she was used, but only standing stock still, with her tail between her legs, her ears flattened, and the hair bristling on her shoulders, seeing this, he left her to herself out of mere humanity. When he came out after half an hour, she found that she was gone, but there was a fair-sized hole by the wall, and she had just buried all but her brush, digging desperately to get under the wall and make her escape. He ran up to the hole and put his arm in after her and called to her to come out, but she would not. So at first he began pulling her out by the shoulder, then, his hold slipping, by the hind legs. As soon as he had drawn her forth, she whipped round and snapped at his hand, and bit it through the joint of the thumb, but let it go instantly. They stayed there for a minute, facing each other, he on his knees and she facing him, the picture of unrepentant wickedness and fury. Being thus on his knees, Mr. Brick was down on her level very nearly, and her muzzle was thrust almost into his face. Her ears lay flat on her head, her gums were bared in a silent snarl, and all her beautiful teeth threatening him that she would bite him again. Her back, too, was half arched, all her hair bristling, and her brush held drooping. But it was her eyes that held his, with their split pupils looking at him with savage desperation and rage. The blood ran very freely from his hand, but he never noticed that, or the pain of it either, for all his thoughts were for his wife. "What is this, Sylvia?" he asked, very quietly. "What is this? Why are you so savage now? If I stand between you and your freedom, it is because I love you. Is it such a torment to be with me?" But Sylvia never stirred a muscle. "You would not do this if you were not in anguish, poor beast. You want your freedom. I cannot keep you. I cannot hold you to the vows you made when you were a woman. Why? You must have forgotten who I am." The tears then began running down his cheeks. He sobbed and said to her, "Go. I shall not keep you, poor beast. Poor beast, I love you, I love you. Go if you want to, but if you remember me, come back. I shall never keep you against your will. Go, go. But kiss me now." He leant forward then and put his lips to her snarling fangs, but though she kept snarling, she did not bite him. Then he got up quickly and went to the door of the garden that opened into a little paddock against a wood. When he opened it, she went through it like an arrow, crossed the paddock like a puff of smoke, and in a moment was gone from his sight. Then, suddenly finding himself alone, Mr. Brick came, as it were, to himself and ran after her, calling her by name and shouting to her, and so went plunging into the wood and through it for about a mile, running almost blindly. At last, when he was worn out, he sat down, seeing that she had gone beyond recovery, and it was already night. Then rising, he walked slowly homewards, wearied and spent in spirit. As he went, he bound up his hand that was still running with blood. His coat was torn, his hat lost, and his face scratched right across with briars. Now, in cold blood, he began to reflect on what he had done and to repent bitterly having set his wife free. He had betrayed her so that now from his act she must lead the life of a wild fox forever, and must undergo all the rigors and hardships of the climate and all the hazards of a hunted creature. When Mr. Brick got back to the cottage, he found Mrs. Cork was sitting up for him. It was already late. "What have you done with Mrs. Brick, sir? I missed her, and I missed you, and I have not known what to do, expecting something dreadful has happened. I have been sitting up for you half the night, and where is she now, sir?" She accosted him so vigorously that Mr. Brick stood silent. At length he said, "I have let her go. She has run away."